Hello. Get your body relaxed. Find a comfortable position to lie down or sit. And if you can, let your eyes slowly close. In today's video, we're going back in time, not to the gilded dynasties or golden empires, but to a dry, dusty, and not so pleasant place, the Wild West. You may have heard of it in the movies, of flashy guns, cold-blooded gunmen, and bustling saloons in the red glow of the desert. But forget all that. Today, we're not going to the West to be heroes. We're going there to be exhausted and maybe to sleep. Imagine yourself lying still. The world is gray, not because it's overcast or even particularly early, but because everything around you is coated in dust. The blankets you've been sleeping under, coarse and scratchy, like old burlap sacks, have collected a fine layer of it during the night. So has your coat, so has your hat, so has your hair. You rarely do. Sleep here in the wild stretches of the American West. Dose and tea arrive like it does in a bed back home, with warmth and pillows and peace. It comes like the wind, briefly, coldly, and without ceremony. Your back aches from the bedroll, or rather, the collection of canvas sacks layered over packed dirt. You hear a creak of wood outside. Maybe it's the wind pulling at the makeshift barn again. Maybe it's one of the others already stirring. Or maybe it's the mule chewing loudly through what's left of the hay. You don't want to move, but you have to. The air is cold when you sit up, dry, cold, sharp as a tin cup left in a mountain stream. It sneaks under your collar and settles in your lungs, making you cough once. It's not a sickly cough, but a dry one. A camp cough, you might call it. Almost everyone here has one. The body adapts to the dust, but never quite accepts it. You pull on your boots, they're stiff. The leather creaked last night. This morning, it doesn't bother to make a sound. There is no bathroom. You know that already, but every morning the thought still crosses your mind. A ghost memory from the life you had before this. There's only the water trough out back where someone's already washed their hands. The surface is oily. It is impossibly cold, but not refreshing. It bites you awake. No one talks yet. Talking in the morning is something that comes slowly, like the light. There's a small fire going by the wagon. Someone's boiling coffee in a soot-blackened pot that looks older than any of you. It's not really coffee, not anymore. It's half grounds, half river water, and all bitterness. Still, you accept the tin cup passed to you. It's warm. That's enough. Breakfast, if it can be called that, is beans from a pot left simmering overnight. They're mushy, oversalted, and slightly metallic from the pan, but they're food. You sit cross-legged in the dirt with your plate in your lap, steam curling up in lazy wisps. Around you, no one complains. No one says anything at all. There's only the rhythmic clatter of spoons on metal. This is the beginning of the day. It hasn't even started yet. You look out over the flat, endless land. To the east, the sun is rising like a dull coin, barely cutting through the haze. The sky is all pale yellow and pink dust. Somewhere far off, a coyote yips once, then falls silent. You're camped on what used to be a buffalo trail. Old, crisscrossed ground with no signposts and no shade. You know from the surveyor that you're about 2 days' ride from the nearest real town. Maybe more if the rivers flooded again. Your job today, like yesterday, is simple in words and hard in body. Clear a fence line, chop posts, dig holes, haul water, patch a roof, help fix the axle of the supply wagon again. You don't get paid by the hour. You get paid by what gets done, or sometimes by who you are able to stay in good graces with. Let's step back for a moment. The American West, in its so-called Golden Age, roughly the mid to late 1800s, was not a place of heroic duels or cinematic showdowns. It was, far more often, a place of quiet labor, of repetition, of things that broke and had to be fixed, of getting up too early and going to sleep too late, and wondering, in between, if you might be safer or better off somewhere else. There's a rhythm to it, not a musical rhythm, but a kind of daily beat. The same boots, the same fire, the same dust in your mouth by 10 a.m. You might be a ranch hand or a trapper, a drifter, perhaps, a hired hand for a rail company, or even part of a small wagon train moving westward with dreams that are already fading under the reality of the terrain. Regardless of your role, you exist within this cycle. You finish your coffee. A gust of wind stirs the canvas above the chuck wagon. The horses stamp their feet, restless already. One of them is limping again. That means someone, probably you, will be walking part of the day. It's easier than explaining why a horse went lame on your watch. Your hands already ache as you lift the axe. The handle is slick with years of use, and your gloves are threadbare at the palms. The wood you're chopping isn't soft pine, it's mesquite, tough and dry as bone. It cracks like thunder when the blade lands right. When it doesn't, it just absorbs the blow with a dull thud that makes your wrists sting. No one claps when you split a log. There are no cheers, no breaks for lemonade. There is only the next log, and the one after that. The sun has risen higher now. Your shirt is soaked, but the air still smells of cold ash and horsehair. You haven't spoken a word all morning, not because there's nothing to say, but because there's too much to do. Mid-morning brings flies, always the flies. They come in small black clouds, persistent and indifferent. They land on your face, on your food, on your tools. You swat them without thinking. It's not anger, it's instinct, like swatting back a memory that keeps returning. The one that asks, "Why did I come out here?" You remember, of course, for land, for gold, for escape, for family, for a fresh start. Or maybe just because there was nowhere left to stay. Whatever the reason, you are here, and you are tired. Around midday, the light changes again. The heat presses down on the camp like a thick woolen blanket. You take shelter in the thin shadow cast by the wagon, just enough to keep the sun off your neck. Lunch is more beans, maybe a strip of jerky, maybe hardtack that needs soaking before your teeth can get through it. It doesn't matter. The food is fuel, not comfort. Someone passes around a bottle, maybe whiskey, maybe worse, and you decline. The water is warm with a metallic Thames, but it keeps you standing for now. The rest of the day stretches ahead like the land itself, dry, uneven, and full of things that need to be done. And somewhere in the distance, you hear it, the hollow sound of hammer on post. It could be a neighbor, rancher. It could be a stranger. You don't go to check. In the West, curiosity is not a virtue. It's often how people disappear. You go back to work. And eventually, quietly, the sun begins to fall again. Evening on the prairie is not like in the cities. It doesn't fade gently into streetlight or candle flame. It collapses. One moment the sky is gold, and the next it is iron gray. The cold returns quickly, sharp as a coin against your skin. You gather near the fire, tired in a way that feels deeper than muscle. The flames crackle. Someone hums a few lines of an old folk song. Someone else plays with a deck of cards, but never deals. You stare at the embers. They shift like memories, flickering, uncertain, and far away. When you lie down again, you know the dirt will be no softer, the blanket no warmer, the stars above no closer. But there is a rhythm here, one your body, slowly and reluctantly, is learning. The West does not welcome you. It does not soothe you. It teaches you to endure. And so, as the coyotes yip once more in the distance, you sleep again. Not deeply, not peacefully, but enough. Let us return now. The morning is behind you, though barely. The sun now sits higher in the sky, pale, unforgiving, casting sharp shadows across the flat plain. The camp is fully awake, and so is the work. In the American West, a day is not measured in hours. It's measured in exhaustion, in blisters, in how far you get before the sun tells you it's time to stop, or your body gives out, whichever comes first. You check your hands, already rough, already stiff, but still moving. Your next task, the well. It's not the first time you've dug here. The old well has gone dry, or perhaps it was always more hope than function. The ground is packed tight with old clay, flecks of gravel, and an endless press of time that refuses to yield easily. You hold the shovel, long-handled, heavy, the blade dulled and dented. The first few digs are the easiest, but soon the resistance sets in. The shovel bites into the earth with a crunch that echoes up through your arms. Then you heave the soil out, one load at a time, and dig and dig. There is no one watching, no supervisor standing over your shoulder, but there is a shared understanding between you and the others that if you dan tidig, no one drinks. The West has many ways of killing a person, but thirst is the quietest. Each scoop of earth carries the scent of dry minerals. You notice, absently, a scorpion under a clump of rocks. It doesn't move. It waits, just like everything else out here. Hours pass this way. You can't be sure how many, but the light shifts again. The angle of the sun now cuts across the lip of the well you've made. Long shadows stretch like old scars across the camp. Later, your job changes. Now, it's the roof. A windstorm passed through 2 nights ago, ripping shingles from the storehouse, a humble structure made of rough-cut pine and tin sheets. The tin flaps rattling gently, like distant thunder behind every breath. You climb the ladder slowly. It wobbles. The nails you carry in your pocket clink like dull coins. Each step up feels higher than the last, not because it's particularly steep, but because every movement requires more than you have left. The sun has begun to bite. Heat radiates off the roof in shimmering waves. The wind, when it comes, is dry and hot, like someone opening the door of an oven in your face. It carries fine grit that settles into your eyelashes, your collar, the crease of your lips. You do not speak. You only hammer. The rhythm is slow, one nail at a time. Your fingers throb with each strike. You're careful not to waste a single one. Nails are not cheap. Nothing is cheap out here, except, perhaps, for life. The sky begins to change again, not toward evening, not yet, but toward something darker, something unexpected. You hear it before you see it, a low, rolling breath across the land, the sound of the wind increasing. The horizon shifts, grows thicker, somehow, grayer, heavier, dust storm. You've heard of them, maybe seen one or two at a distance. But now, the wall of wind and soil is crawling closer, like a beast with no shape, only hunger. The instructions are clear, if basic. Cover what you can, tie down what you must, and get inside something, anything. You descend the ladder with shaking legs. The air has already changed, cooler but charged. It smells like dust and static. The animals are restless. The horses shift in place. The chickens, what few you've managed to keep alive, are already squawking, feathers puffed, uneasy. You move fast, everyone does. The wagon canvas gets tied down tight. The well gets covered with planks. You press your face into a bandana, not to look heroic, but to breathe. Then the wall arrives. It is not fast, like a movie might show you. It's relentless. The sky doesn't go black, not immediately, but it loses all definition. There is no more up, no more east or west, just a constant sideways motion of grit. The wind howls through the camp, shrieking between boards and flapping tent corners. The dust gets into your eyes, no matter how tightly you close them. It gets into your nose, your teeth, your thoughts. You crouch inside the storehouse, the same roof you fixed an hour ago, and wait. You don't speak. No one does. Time loses shape in the storm. Maybe it lasts 20 minutes. Maybe it's an hour. Eventually, the wind moves on, as all things must. And then, stillness. The dust settles slowly, like ash. Everything you owned, every pot, every rope, every pair of boots, is now the same color. Gray-brown, indifferent, tired. You step outside. The camp looks older now. The buildings coated in a new skin. The wagon wheels sunk slightly deeper into the soil. The horses breathing heavily, eyes blinking in the fading light. But you're still here. The day hasn't ended. But something in it has. You feel it in your bones. That quiet ache that tells you VA passed some invisible test. You've endured what was given, and now only the rest of the day remains. You find the pump. The handle sticks. You work it slowly, one groaning pull at a time, until a trickle of water appears. You splash it over your face and arms, though it does little to cleanse. The dust is in your skin now. There's still one more thing to do before night. You help gather kindling, twigs, broken branches, even small bits of torn canvas from the storm. Anything that will burn slow and steady. The fire is built with care in silence. And finally, the camp breathes again. The wind is gone. The light has softened. Someone pulls out a harmonica, blows 2 notes, then puts it away. It's enough. You sit by the fire. You do not talk. You do not sing. You listen to the wood cracking. to the strange quiet of a place that demands so much and offers so little. And still, you remain. When the stars come out, they are bright, brighter than you remember stars being, brighter than electric light, than lanterns or candles, brighter, perhaps, than hope. But maybe that's just the dust in your eyes. You lie down. The same spot as last night, the same blanket, the same dirt. But now, it feels earned. The day didn't end, not really. But it softened, it bent, and soon it will repeat itself with new wind and new labor and new stillness. But for now, just sleep. Let's begin with a name. Wyatt Earp. To most ears, the name conjures something sharp. A badge, a gun, a standoff in the street beneath a blazing sun. For many, Wyatt Earp exists almost as folklore, an ideal of frontier, justice, upright, unflinching, legendary. But legends are, by their nature, incomplete. Wyatt Earp was not a simple man. In this segment, we'll step quietly into the world behind the myth, into the parts of his life that didn't end up in movie scripts or bronze plaques. We'll follow the contours of his days, the uncertain, the uncomfortable, the undramatic, the version of Wyatt Earp that lived, not just the one that lasted. A young man without a map, Wyatt Berrystab Earp was born in 1848 in Monmouth, Illinois. His early years were defined not by gunfights or gallantry, but by movement, always movement. The Earp family drifted westward like so many others, carried by the promise of land and the slow pull of opportunity. From Illinois to Iowa to California and back again, the family rarely settled long. The frontier had a way of pushing its people forward before they were ready. As a teenager, Wyatt tried to enlist in the Union Army, but was turned away for being underage. His older brothers fought in the Civil War, but he was left behind, stuck in the half-light between boyhood and manhood. He worked odd jobs, drove wagons, loaded freight, spent long hours with his hands on reins and his mind full of dust and questions. He married young. At 22, he wed Urilla Sutherland, and within a year, she died, possibly of typhoid. Some accounts suggest she was pregnant at the time. Wyatt never spoke much about her afterward, but the loss shaped him, quietly, lastingly. It was after this that Wyatt began drifting. Not just geographically, but morally. A man untethered. A man trying to find who he was by becoming many things. A lawman. Occasionally, it's often said that Wyatt Earp was a lawman, and that's true. But not only true, he served at various times as a deputy sheriff, a town constable, and a deputy U.S. Marshal. But these roles were often temporary and often complicated. He was not above bending rules to get what he wanted. He arrested men for carrying weapons and then drank with them afterward. He enforced laws selectively, sometimes for his own benefit. He took bribes. He gambled. He ran saloons and dealt cards, and, in more than one town, operated brothels with his brothers. The distinction between lawman and outlaw was not a solid line. In many towns, it was barely a shadow. You could wear a badge at noon and gamble beside a known thief by evening. Wyatt Earp did both, but still, he carried himself with a quiet certainty. He didn't drink excessively. He rarely smiled. He kept his voice low. He was, in many ways, a man who contained his own silence. Work that doesn't get you remembered. Most of Wyatt's time in the West was not spent in shootouts. It was spent in maintenance, repairing damaged doors at the saloon, chasing down debts, calling barrels of beer up dusty stairs, arguing with town councilmen about permits, hiring musicians who never showed up, sitting at the far end of a poker table for 12 hours straight. These are not the kinds of stories that become legends, but they are what life was for Wyatt Earp. He tried mining for silver in Colorado, tried gambling in San Diego, tried promoting boxing matches in Alaska, tried over and over again to find something that worked, but nothing quite stuck. The Wild West was fading, and Wyatt Earp was fading with it. There is a temptation to think of men like Earp in binary, good or bad, hero or villain, but he resisted categories. He worked alongside conmen, but hated thieves. He protected women in his saloon, but had no qualms exploiting their labor. He upheld law and order, but frequently fled from legal charges in one town by moving to another. He was righteous when it suited him, and flexible when it didn't. Even those who knew him best often disagreed on who he really was. His companions described him as loyal but cold, brave but emotionally distant. He was married, in effect, if not in law, to a woman named Josephine Marcus. She was Jewish, strong-willed, and fiercely private. Earp, but they rarely appeared in public. They had no children. They left behind almost no letters. Theirs was a life lived at the edges, unremarked upon, but deeply entangled. The weight of a legend. It wasn't tea until the final years of his life, and long after them, that Wyatt Earp became a household name. In the 1920s, he was a quiet, aging man in Los Angeles, known more for his hat and his past than his presence. He died in 1929 at the age of 80 in a rented house. He had outlived most of his brothers, most of his enemies, and almost all of the world he once helped shape. But in his final years, Hollywood came knocking. Screenwriters, journalists, and filmmakers sought him out, not for who he was, but for what he represented. They asked him, about the gunfight at the OK Corral, and he told them what they wanted to hear, or perhaps what he could still remember. The stories were polished, the rough edges worn smooth. The truth became a little harder to locate. When he died, he was cremated. His ashes were buried in Colma, California, far from the desert towns that had made him famous. But his name lived on. And yet, behind that name, there was always a man who lost a wife, a man who chased money and lost it, a man who survived the West not because he was the fastest or the most righteous, but because he was, above all, adaptable. Wyatt Earp was not a cowboy. He was not a gunslinger. He was not a saint. He was something more common, more human, a man who lived in hard times and made hard choices. And perhaps that is the most authentic story of all. Let's go there now. Tombstone, Arizona. It sounds mythical now, a name forged for drama. But in the 1880s, it was real. A mining boom town teetering between wealth and ruin, civility and chaos. And like so many towns on the western frontier, Tombstone didn't grow. It erupted. Silver veins brought floods of money, people, and lawlessness. It was dusty, crowded, violent. And for a time, Wyatt Earp called it home. The town on the edge in 1880, when Wyatt arrived, Tombstone had no paved streets. Its buildings were mostly wood and canvas, but it had saloons, more than 100 of them, gambling halls, dance parlors, brothels, churches, too, though they were fewer. It had money, and with money came vice. Wyatt came with his brothers, Virgil, Morgan, and James. Some had families, some had pasts they were trying to leave behind. Like many men of their era, they brought with them a complex mix of purpose and opportunism. Wyatt hoped to win a seat as county sheriff, but he was not a wealthy man, and Tombstone was already populated by people who controlled its flows of cash and power. Mine owners, railroad men, politicians. To survive, Wyatt and his brothers did what they always did. They took up law enforcement jobs, small ones, with vague jurisdictions and minimal pay. Sometimes they helped settle disputes. Sometimes they simply watched. And sometimes they chose sides. The cowboys, not the kind with white hats and cinematic flair. These were a loosely organized group of outlaws, cattle rustlers, stagecoach robbers, smugglers, referred to collectively as the cowboys. They weren't hidden. They drank openly in town, spent freely, carried weapons. Local politics, often corrupt, gave them soft immunity. Some had friends on the city council. Some had family in the press. They weren't just tolerated. They were entangled with the town's fabric. The Earps, particularly Virgil and Wyatt, saw them as a threat, but more importantly, as competition, for control, for reputation, and for legitimacy. The tension built slowly, like a pot left to simmer too long. A gunfight, but not really. October 26, 1881. The event that would become known as the gunfight at the OK Corral lasted about 30 seconds. It didn't actually happen at the OK Corral. It occurred in a narrow lot behind it, 15 to 20 feet wide, framed by a boarding house on one side and a photography studio on the other. 7 men stood there. 3 would not leave alive. The Earps, Wyatt, Virgil, and Morgan were joined by Doc Holliday, a tubercular dentist turned gambler turned gunman. They approached a group of cowboys, Billy Clanton, Tom, and Frank McClory, and Billy Claiborne. To disarm them, accounts vary. Some say the cowboys were surrendering. Others say they reached for their weapons. Some claim the first shot came from Doc Holliday, others from Frank McClory. But the gunfire began. It ended quickly. Frank and Tom McClory lay dead. Billy Clanton was dying in the dirt. The street went silent, and Wyatt Earp was still standing. After the smoke cleared, here's what the movies rarely show. What happens after the gunfight? There were no parades, no medals. The Earps were arrested. A month-long legal hearing followed. Witnesses contradicted each other. Emotions ran high. The judge ultimately ruled that the Earps had acted within their duties as peace officers, but vindication did not mean safety. The cowboys wanted revenge. They did not wait long. The true cost of that day in December 1881, Virgil Earp was ambushed, shot from the shadows while walking down a street. He survived, but his arm was shattered, permanently crippled. 3 months later, Morgan Earp was killed while playing billiards, shot through a window by unknown assailants. He died within minutes. Wyatt held his brother as he bled. He didn't cry. He didn't speak, but he acted. What followed became known unofficially as the Earp Vendetta Ride. Wyatt, Doc Holliday, and a small group of loyalists rode out into the desert, hunting those responsible for Morgan's death. Several men were killed in the weeks that followed, shot without trial, buried in unmarked graves. There were no more legal hearings, only silence. Wyatt left Tombstone soon after. He would never return. A life in shadow. The events in Tombstone were brief. Just over a year from arrival to departure. But they defined the rest of Wyatt Earp's life. Wherever he went, from California to Colorado to Alaska, he carried the weight of that half-minute of violence. People whispered. Some saw him as a hero, others a killer. In truth, he was both and neither. He tried to leave it behind, but myths travel faster than men. In the years that followed, stories about Tombstone grew. Details blurred. Enemies became archetypes. Morality became cinematic. And in the center of it all, Wyatt Earp, standing in the dust, was frozen in time. The real end when Wyatt died in 1929. The West was already gone. The frontier had closed. The towns had changed. The railroads had won. He died in a rented home in Los Angeles. He had no children. He left behind no memoir, no final words of glory. But by then, it didn't matter. Others would tell his story for him, and they would tell it loudly. But in the quiet corners of history, we find something more valuable than legend. Imagine you are walking alone. The air is still. The land is still. The land is wide and open. The kind of vastness that makes sound feel shy and footsteps feel too loud. Before you lies a town, but there is no movement, no smoke, no people. Only the hollow frames of buildings, some leaning, others collapsed. A saloon with broken shutters, a church with no bell, a jail whose door still swings gently in the wind. This is not a movie set. This is not a museum. This is a ghost town, one of hundreds scattered like bones across the American West, and each one, every nail, every board, every rusted hinge, once held a life, or many. The boom before the bust. To understand ghost towns, you have to understand the rush. Not the gold rush, though that's part of it, but the rush for hope, for land, for wealth, yes, but also for belonging. In the mid to late 19th century, the West was a canvas waiting for dreams to be painted on it, and the brushes were mining and railroads. A new vein of silver discovered in a remote canyon could summon hundreds of people within weeks. Tents sprang up, then timber walls, then saloons, then a jail. Always a jail. Then a general store, then a blacksmith, and then sometimes a school. These places had names: Bodie, Calico, Rhyolite, Glenrio, St. Elmo, names that echoed ambition or local rivers, or the dreams of someone who'd planted the first stake. They lived for a time like real cities. Some had newspapers, some had opera houses, some even had gaslights flickering down the main street. And then something shifted. The silver ran out. The gold moved elsewhere. The railroad bypassed them. The investors pulled out, or the well just dried. And when it did, people didn't stay. They couldn't. They left fast and often quietly. Decay without drama. What makes a ghost town so haunting is not that it was destroyed, but that it was simply left. No fires, no wars, just abandonment. Chairs left at tables, tools on benches. A child's shoe, small and cracked, forgotten under a cot. Rain came, wood warped, winds howled through empty doorways. And over time, the town began to forget itself. Roofs fell in, floorboards rotted, roads returned to dirt, and no one wrote obituaries for these places. No one charted their deaths. They were not lost in tragedy, but in silence. Archaeology of the ordinary, if you visit one of these ghost towns today, and many still stand, you'll find more than ruins. You'll find stories buried in the dust. They are mundane ones, and that's what makes them powerful. A chipped teacup still resting on a shelf. A calendar on the wall stopped at April 1889. A rusted cash register. A typewriter with half the keys missing. These are not relics of war. They are relics of daily life. In a town called Bannack, Montana, you can still walk into the schoolhouse. The desks are there. The chalkboard is still on the wall. Faded, illegible, but real. You can feel the echo of children whispering, of lessons taught and forgotten, of lives lived in between the pages of history books. People who never became names. What's perhaps most striking about these places is that no one became famous there. Not really. Most residents of ghost towns were miners, blacksmiths, saloon workers, seamstresses, farmers. People who woke up early, worked hard, went to sleep tired. They didn't write memoirs. They didn't lead revolts. They didn't get statues. But their absence is profound. Walking through a ghost town, you realize you are stepping into someone's yesterday, into the room where they cooked, the porch where they rested, the window they looked through while wondering whether the money would hold out. There are no plaques to tell you their names, only the quiet weight of what they left behind, the ghost town as memory. It's tempting to think of these towns as curiosities, historical oddities for travelers to photograph and forget. But they are something deeper. They are memory made physical. They are what happens when ambition outpaces stability, when dreams are built faster than foundations. And they are a reminder that the West was not a single story, not just a saga of gunslingers and heroes, but a landscape full of half-written chapters. Ghost towns are not haunted by unfinished sentences. Nightfall in the forgotten imagine staying a night in one of these places. No electricity, no sound but the wind, no company but the creaking boards and your own breath. As the sun sets behind the hills, shadows stretch long across collapsed fences. A dry breeze stirs the loose door of a barn. A rusted horseshoe clinks as it falls from a nail. Disturbed by nothing, you understand something very old. That silence is louder where lives once were. That decay is not sad, it is honest, and that The past does not vanish. It just waits. Imagine walking through an overgrown field. There are no signs, no fences, only a gentle swell in the land, a few jagged planks poking out of the soil. Weather-worn, splintered, and blank. You realize, after a moment, that you are walking through a cemetery. But this is not a place of marble angels or polished epitaphs. This is a place where death came quietly and left, even quieter. Welcome to the other half of the ghost town, the one beneath your feet. No time for gravestones in many frontier settlements. Death came often and inconveniently. It did not arrive with orchestras or announcements. It came suddenly from infection, accident, childbirth, violence, starvation. And when it did, there was often no time, money, or energy to mark the loss. Many of the earliest graves were shallow, quickly dug, and covered with wood, stones, or simply the hope that no animals would disturb the site. Names, if remembered at all, they were remembered orally, passed between neighbors, held for a season, and then forgotten. What archaeologists find in the 20th and 21st centuries, as researchers began uncovering these graveyards, they didn't find monuments. They found fragments, bits of belt buckles, shoe nails, shirt buttons, a ceramic bead from a bracelet, a pipe stem, a crumbling book clasp, sometimes a tooth, loose and worn, sometimes a shard of mirror, more rarely a name carved roughly into a plank and buried with the body, meant to be temporary. The bones themselves are often in poor condition, not because of mistreatment, but because the ground, over time, does not respect memory. What is left is not a person, exactly, but the suggestion of a life. A body bent by labor, joints swollen from horseback riding, teeth filed by grit in the food, fingers warped from tools. These details whisper a story, not of who they were, but of what their days were like. Child graves. To one of the most sobering discoveries in Western grave archaeology is the high number of children buried with no surviving record. Infant mortality on the frontier was devastatingly high. Medical help was days away, if it existed at all. And food, even when available, was often nutritionally poor. Tiny caskets, hastily constructed, buried beside family shacks, sometimes under trees, sometimes inside barns, sometimes simply anywhere. There are no lullabies preserved for them, no stories passed down, just a row of 4 mismatched stones in dry ground, in a forgotten canyon where someone once wept. What the graves tell us, these graves, or the spaces where graves used to be, do not glamorize the West. They tell us something more useful, more intimate. They show that life here was unstable, that the American dream of land, freedom, and independence was paid for in toil, loss, and impermanence. People lived short lives, often anonymous ones. They came hoping for prosperity. Many found only difficulty, and when they died, they left behind evidence of effort, not triumph. It humbles you to see it in the ground. It softens your assumptions. It reminds you that history isn't always written in ink. Sometimes it's just dirt that resists forgetting. Rituals of goodbye, yet not all graves were impersonal. In some locations, archaeologists find tokens, small objects left deliberately, not useful, not valuable, but meaningful. A glass marble, a horseshoe nail bent into a heart, a pocket Bible with pages missing, but one verse still circled. These are not grand gestures. They are small rituals of goodbye, fleeting, fragile acts of memory. In a place where the land itself tried to erase the past, these gestures whisper, "You were here. You mattered. We tried to remember you." Who were they? We don't know most of their names. We rarely know their faces. They were miners, mothers, laborers, immigrants, freedmen, wanderers, people whose hands hurt, whose dreams didn't pan out, people who were, in the end, exhausted. But for a few years, they tried. They built fences. They hauled water. They danced once a month. They baked bread when they could. They told stories by firelight. They watched the sky with tired eyes. And then they were gone, standing there. Now, when you visit one of these graveyards, or rather, one of these almost forgotten grounds, you do not feel haunted. You feel witnessed. The West is full of these places, tucked behind sagebrush, hidden behind collapsed barns, marked only by the way the wind pauses as it passes through. They are not scary. They are quiet. They are tender. They are true. What we learn from the unmarked. It's easy to think history belongs to the ones with names carved in marble. But in truth, much of it, perhaps most of it, belongs to those whose names were carved into wood, then into memory, and then lost, and yet they left traces. Through the archaeology of forgotten graves, we are reminded that hardship was not an occasional visitor here. It was a daily companion, and memory, like bone, is fragile. It's night now. The sky above the west stretches wide and black, peppered with stars. The fire before you is small, low, steady, just enough to keep the cold from biting too deep. You're surrounded by quiet voices, not the voices of ghosts, but the voices of stories. Stories passed from mouth to mouth, told slowly, with pauses in all the right places. With eyes squinting toward, the darkened shoulders pulled close against the chill. This is where the unwritten West lives. Not in newspapers, not in ledgers, but in whispers, in warnings, in wonder. The West was never empty, though settlers called it a new world. This land was already ancient when they arrived, long before railroads and revolvers, long before Wyatt Earp or silver strikes. This land was home to peoples whose stories ran as deep as the canyons, as wide as the sky. The Navajo, the Apache, the Ute, the Paiute, the Comanche, each with their own language, their own cosmology, and their own understanding of what dwelled in the deserts, mountains, and woods. To many, the land was not just a resource. It was alive. It remembered. It responded. And sometimes it watched. The things not named one common thread across many cultures of the West, both indigenous and settler, is restraint. There are stories you're not supposed to tell aloud. There are names you avoid saying at night. There are trails you do not walk after sundown. Not a ghost, but a human who has taken on darkness. A shapeshifter, a creature of malevolent will. Among some frontier folk, they told of the Lantern Man, a distant light that dances through the canyons, luring the lonely traveler off course. Follow it, and you might vanish, as if you had never been. Some believed in cursed silver, metal dug too greedily from earth that never wanted to be touched. Others spoke of the whistling dead, men who died in blizzards and were buried upright, forever cursed to wander the snow, calling out for help that never comes. These stories didn't scream. They murmured. They lingered. They weren't always believed. But they were rarely laughed at. Campfire logic. Imagine yourself as a traveler in the 1870s. It's night. You've ridden 40 miles. Your boots are stiff with dried mud. You build a small fire and cook whatever's left from your pack. And then you hear it. A rustle in the brush. A low whistle. A silence that feels too intentional. You tell yourself it's nothing. But your hand goes to your revolver anyway. Not because you expect trouble, but because someone once told you a story. Stories in the West served many purposes. They explained what couldn't be measured. They protected what couldn't be guarded. They gave shape to fear and form to isolation. They were a company in a place where loneliness could howl louder than wolves. Tales from the miners, the drifters, the widows. In mining camps, tales spread of tunnels that led nowhere. And then, somewhere, when you weren't ready, of voices echoing when no one else was inside. Women who kept inns told of travelers who vanished. Men who checked in but left their rooms cold and untouched. Were they real? Were they illusions? And what do you do when the line between memory and the imagination fades in the lamplight. You pour more coffee. You sit closer to the fire, and you repeat the story, not to scare, but to hold on to something. Even the lawmen believed. It wasn't just the superstitious or the solitary who told these stories. Even lawmen, veterans, schoolteachers, all had a tale. Doc Holliday reportedly refused to sleep in a particular room in a Colorado boarding house. Why? He never said, but he once muttered, "Too many shoes, not enough feet." Wyatt Earp, in old age, told of riding across a mesa at twilight and seeing a campfire light that vanished as he approached, not doused, but simply gone, as though it had been made of memory. These men weren't prone to poetry, but sometimes the West made poets out of skeptics. The ghosts were not always people. One of the most haunting elements of Western folklore is that the ghosts weren't always human. Sometimes they were places. A bend in the river where cattle drowned every season. A mine that collapsed twice, once with men inside, once with no one. A town where clocks stopped at the same hour, even decades later. The West had a long memory, longer than any ledger, and sometimes longer than forgiveness. Why these stories persist even now, you'll find them, the old stories, in ranger stations, in campgrounds, in towns that are now just intersections and a wind-worn sign. They persist not because they are true in the factual sense, but because they were true to the people who told them, true to the loneliness, true to the danger, true to the need to explain what the land refused to clarify. And maybe that's enough. One last flame. Let's return to that campfire. It's nearly out now, just coals glowing orange. The stars above seem closer, the silence complete. You hear nothing, but you feel watched, not in fear, but in a kind of ancient curiosity, maybe by the land, maybe by the past, maybe by the stories themselves, waiting to be remembered one more time before they flicker out. You lie back, close your eyes, and let the dark take you. There is no final twist, only the soft hush of wind and the comforting weight of history murmuring at the edges of sleep. Let's walk into a different kind of room now. Not a bunkhouse, not a saloon, but an office. Wood-paneled, high-ceilinged. The windows are long, framed in heavy velvet curtains. There's a desk, polished oak, solid as a cathedral door. And behind it, a man. He's not wearing a holster. He doesn't carry a rifle. He wears a cravat. His shoes are polished. His cufflinks shimmer faintly in the gaslight. This is the banker, or the mine boss, or the railroad representative. He doesn't shout. He rarely threatens. And yet, his decisions ripple across hundreds of lives. In the Wild West, power did not always come from a barrel. It came quietly and enduringly from balance sheets. In the late 19th century, the American West underwent a shift from chaotic expansion to calculated development. And that shift came not from the frontier, but from the boardroom. As towns stabilized, banks were among the first institutions to appear. First as simple safes behind a bar, then as full-fledged buildings with stone facades, barred windows, and employees in suits. These banks didn't just store money, they directed its flow. They decided which rancher got a loan, which miner got to expand, which saloon owner could stay afloat. And that power extended far beyond money. If you crossed the bank, you might find your credit ruined. If you pleased it, you might find yourself on a faster track to land ownership or political office. These were not elected officials, but they had veto power over prosperity. Mining magnates and paper kings in towns built around mining, like Leadville, Deadwood, or Virginia City. It was the mine owners who called the shots. They rarely went underground. They didn't handle picks or lanterns, but they owned the land, and with it, the livelihoods of hundreds. They negotiated contracts with Eastern investors, skimmed profits off freight deals, and lobbied territorial governments for favorable regulations. In a town like Bisbee, Arizona, a single mining company could control the land leases, the rail access, the housing prices, the general store inventory, and even the sheriff's budget. These men weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They had lawyers, clerks, and handwritten contracts that carried more weight than any six-shooter. Behind the saloon curtain, organized power, some saloon owners were just barkeeps. But the successful ones were often something more. They acted as lenders, political brokers, and gatekeepers. They decided who got hired for a card game, who could open a competing business, who got served, and who got watched. Many were immigrants or second-generation Americans who learned to read the rhythms of a town, when to offer credit, when to call in a debt, when to make a donation to the mayor's campaign fund. They weren't necessarily corrupt, but they were embedded in every civic decision, every Saturday night, every election. Their ledgers didn't just track money. They tracked alliances. What about the politicians? Towns often had mayors. Some were noble. Some were criminals with titles. But the most successful mayors weren't the ones who gave speeches. They were the ones who knew how to navigate the bankers, the mine owners, the saloon bosses, and the railroad agents. The real power was rarely visible. It moved through dinner invitations, handshake agreements, and unrecorded favors. Want a new road built? A jail repaired? A judge persuaded? It started in the back room of the bank, not in the courthouse. Power is quiet, One of the great myths of the West is that conflict was always public. Gunfights, hangings, bar fights. But those were symptoms, not causes. Real power was exercised quietly in ledgers and contracts. Who owned the land under the saloon? Who leased the water rights to the ranch? Who controlled the telegraph office? These questions decided futures, and the answers rarely came from men with worn hats and dusty boots. They came from men who never had to leave their chairs, and yet, these men, too, were vulnerable. Booms went bust. Banks failed. Railroads changed direction. And the same quiet forces that built fortunes could also erase them overnight. A banker in 1885 might control a town. By 1892, he might be boarding a train with a single suitcase, heading east with debts no one would ever collect. The West had little patience for stagnation. Even the powerful were, in some way, rented by time. Their legacy, today, you can still find the buildings. The bank, always the tallest on the street. The courthouse, solid and stern. The mansion, often on a hill above the rest of town. Built with profits from a mine no one remembers. They stand like exclamation points in otherwise quiet places. But inside, the ledgers are gone. The wallpaper peels. The carpets have been taken by mice, and the people who once sat behind the desks, gone, forgotten. Their names, perhaps, in a deed, or on a faded newspaper ad, but their faces and their fears have been lost to time. Quiet power, loud consequences, so the next time you picture the Wild West, don't just see the gunfighter or the outlaw. Remember the man with the fountain pen, the woman who managed 3 properties and 2 hotels, the clerk who moved a decimal in a payroll book and changed a family's fate. They didn't shoot their way through history. They signed their way through it. And in doing so, they built the invisible skeletons of towns that would rise and fall just as quietly as they lived. Close your eyes just for a moment. You are no longer under open sky, no longer wrapped in canvas or wool, but surrounded by carved wood, imported curtains, and the faint aroma of lamp oil mixed with lavender. You've entered a parlor. A piano sits near the wall, a globe, a bookshelf lined with volumes from Boston, New York, maybe even Paris. The windows are framed in drapes too heavy for the desert. The carpet, thick and deep, was dragged across mountains by mule train. Someone hands you a glass. It's crystal. The whiskey is older than the town itself. This is the West's upper tier. Its soft core, its small, curated world of quiet wealth. It's not as famous as the saloons or shootouts, but it lasted longer. The creation of Western gentility by the 1880s. As towns grew into cities and economies began to stabilize, there emerged a group who no longer thought of themselves as settlers or survivors. They were the settled, the successful, the ones who owned the hotels, the newspapers, the rail depots, or the telegraph franchises. And they were eager to distinguish themselves, not only from the working poor, but also from the memory of their own dusty beginnings. They built homes with imported wallpaper, threw dinners with silver cutlery, read aloud from Dickens, Emerson, or the latest serialized novels. In places like Denver, Santa Fe, and Sacramento, one might find clubs, concert halls, even traveling opera companies, funded by people determined to bring culture to the edge of the map. What did luxury look like in the West? Luxury here didn't always mean opulence. It often meant escape from discomfort. Bathtubs with heated water were a luxury. Fresh linens that didn't carry the scent of wood smoke. Clocks that chimed on the hour. Imported cheeses, even if only once a month. Even small touches, a lace table runner, a painted teacup, a polished boot jack, were more than decorations. They were signals meant to remind others that this was not just a mining camp anymore. One prominent Arizona hostess kept a grand mirror from New Orleans above her fireplace. It reflected the entire parlor, giving the illusion of space and a glimpse of a more civilized world. In Nevada, a rancher's wife planted a rose garden in the high desert. She imported soil by wagon load. The roses rarely bloomed, but when they did, she served tea beside them, as if the West had agreed to behave for just an hour. The rules of respectability to belong to high society, one needed more than wealth. You needed manners. You needed stories. You needed to know who not to talk to. Children were taught how to curtsy or bow. Young women played piano. Men wrote letters in longhand with engraved stationery. Everything had an unspoken rule. Dinner was served promptly. Servants were to enter and exit without sound. Dancing with the same partner more than twice in a night. Questionable. Beneath the chandeliers and fine china, judgment flowed like wine. Your accent, your clothing, the way you folded your napkin, all were watched. All could elevate you or end your invitations. And yet, just outside, while inside these houses things gleamed and whispered, outside, dust devils chased each other down empty alleys. Cows wandered into schoolyards. Water shortages meant gardens dried in days. Gunshots echoed from time to time. Not often, but enough. The contrast was not hidden. It was acknowledged, but not dwelled upon. There was a quiet agreement among the upper class to maintain the illusion, to keep the world framed in drapery, not in dust. The power of the dinner table. Many decisions were not made in courtrooms or banks, but in dining rooms, A railroad route shifted because a mayor shared a bottle of wine with a magnate. A school was funded after a supper conversation turned nostalgic. A local newspaper editor changed political tones after a hostess smiled, just the right way, over dessert. These tables were more than places to eat. They were arenas of influence, and to sit at them, one needed poise, not a pistol. The women who held the center much of this world was orchestrated not by men in suits, but by women in long dresses. They ran homes like institutions, managed staff, ordered supplies, chose which guests to seat beside each other and which to separate. They wrote letters of introduction, organized fundraisers, founded libraries. Some did so with husbands, others alone, widowed, or never married, or simply smarter than the men they'd once depended on. They read, they painted, they taught, and they preserved a standard, fragile, beautiful, and often exhausting. The cost of high society, this world was not free from pain. The pressure to maintain appearances often meant crushing debt. Imported fabrics costs a fortune. Real silver had to be polished constantly. Manners, once slipped, were hard to recover. Some families collapsed under the weight of their own drawing rooms. Some quietly sold off heirlooms. Some packed up and moved east, pretending they'd never left. The parlor could be a prison, the wainscoting a wall. And yet, it endured, because it gave people a sense of control in a land that otherwise refused to be tamed. One more glass. Imagine now the evening drawing down. The gas lamps flicker. The piano has gone quiet. The glasses are half full. Outside, the wind moans low through cottonwoods. Inside, a woman straightens a picture frame. A man leans back in his chair, eyes closed, listening to the silence between tick and talk. There is peace here, or at least the impression of peace, and sometimes that was enough. The curtains are drawn now, not by choice, but by time. The carpets are still thick, but they smell of dust and mildew. The china cabinet is half empty. The piano has gone out of tune, not from use, but from abandonment. What happens to power when there is no longer anyone to admire it? This is the final story of the West's elite, not of their rule, but of their retreat, of slow decay, silent departures, and a dignity that crumbles more quietly than any saloon ever did. The railroad moves on. So many fortunes in the West were tied to a single force: the railroad. It brought prosperity, people, imports, culture, and often the illusion that a town had made it. But railroads were ruthless in their pragmatism, if or ran out. If a rival town offered better tax breaks, the line might shift, a spur removed, a depot closed. and with it went the lifeblood of towns that had once held banquets in chandeliered halls. The train stopped coming, the visitors stopped arriving, and the houses, grand, proud, full of velvet and quiet judgment, began to feel like theaters left dark after a play, fires that didn't spare parlors. Many western towns burned. Wood structures, dry air, high winds, careless lamps. No matter how carefully designed, fire did not discriminate. A single candle tipped by a child, a kitchen stove left too hot, a lightning strike. You'd see it in the morning. A blackened frame, a chandelier fused into slag, china warped and cracked, books turned to ash. A matron might stand at the edge of the street in a lace dressing gown, holding a silver candelabra, the only item saved. The fire never cared how many dinner parties you had hosted. The slow creep of bankruptcy, even without fire, comfort eroded. Markets crashed, silver prices fell, crops were lost. National panics in the 1890s and early 1900s shook the foundations of families who had once been untouchable. You could hear it in conversations. We've sold the third carriage. The staff has been reduced to 2. The dining room is no longer used unless it's Christmas. Some sold antiques to Eastern dealers. Some closed the curtains and refused callers. Some packed their trunks and left before the neighbors could whisper. No bullet holes. No outlaws. Just ledgers. Again. But this time with more red ink than black. Homes that became echoes over time. The homes changed. The velvet faded. The wall sconces tarnished. The window panes cracked, and no one bothered to replace them. Sometimes a granddaughter returned from the city to see the place where her grandmother had once held court, and found only dust and silence. Sometimes the homes were sold and turned into schools, hotels, or county offices. Sometimes they were simply locked, left to sag slowly under sun and snow. Mice crept into the pantries. The garden choked with weeds. The piano's ivory keys yellowed. And history crept in, not as a headline, but as quiet decay. What happened to the families? They moved on, back east, Tex, or further west into cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, or Seattle. Some reinvented themselves. Others disappeared into obscurity. There are archives in dusty libraries with boxes labeled Carster's Estate, Bisbee. Wainwright family, defunct ranch holdings, Holcomb correspondence, 1887 to 1901. Inside are letters, receipts, and photographs. Faded smiles behind parasols and polished boots. And yet, for all their preservation, there's a quiet understanding. The world these people build does not exist anymore. You can still visit in some towns, their houses remain. Guided tours will show you the fine woodwork, the iron stoves, the dumbwaiter system. A docent may point out a child's name etched in a window pane, scratched there in 1893. You may see a guest book last signed in 1904. It feels like a museum. But if you listen closely, beyond the footsteps of tourists, beyond the explanations, you might hear something deeper. Not ghosts, not spirits, but fragility. A whisper from wood and wallpaper that says, this, too, was temporary. This, too, had its season. This, too, was believed to last forever. Dust reclaims everything in the end. Dust returns to velvet, to carpet, to chandelier. It is the most patient force in the West. It doesn't break down doors. It waits, and when all the guests have left, when all the ledgers have closed, when the final glass of whiskey has been emptied and set on the sideboard, dust enters, settles, and stays. Not out of cruelty, but because it knows the truth. Everything passes. So now, here you are. Not in a specific place. Not in a saloon, or a tent, or a banker's study, but somewhere between them all. Somewhere in the hush after the story ends, when the echoes are still fading, and the silence feels softer than before. You've walked the dusty streets, sat beside the dying fire, heard the hush of a parlor room and the howl of wind outside a graveyard gate. And now, the West, as we've known it through these past hours, begins to dim. A landscape of struggle, not spectacle. There is a myth that the American West was bold and fast and glorious. But what we found instead is that it was often slow, tiring, and quietly resilient. The people who lived there, whether they carried badges or brooms, were not trying to be legends. They were trying to make it through another day. Their victories were small, their losses quiet, and their legacy is felt more than seen. In the way time erodes timber, but leaves intention. Sleep beneath the sky, imagine now lying back in the tall grass just beyond a ghost town. The stars above are the same ones Wyatt Earp saw. The same stars that flickered over wagons, cart tables, copper mines, and forgotten beds. The ground beneath you is warm from the day's heat, and the night air carries only the sound of wind brushing dry stalks. There are no more gunshots, no more ledgers, no more climbing ladders or folding napkins just so. Only the memory of effort, of people doing what they could with what they had, and then letting go. The comfort of forgetting you may not remember every name or every town, or every hidden grave or whispered legend. That's okay. The West has already forgotten most of itself. It doesn't need you to hold its history. It only asks that you have felt it. In your breath, in your stillness, in the quiet recognition that all things pass, even hardship, even grandeur, even stories. A final image, one last time. Let's picture this. A porch at twilight. A rocking chair creaking slowly. A glass of something strong and sweet, half full. A woman with her feet tucked beneath her skirt. A man leaning against the railing, humming softly. No one speaks. The day is over. The chores are done. And the land, as wide and tired as ever, stretches out before them like a quilt of gold and shadow. They're not asking for more, only to rest, to sit, to fade, eventually, into the same dust that bore them. And you've come far, not by horseback or wagon, but by attention. You've wandered the West through the quietest corners, not the ones in the books, but the ones behind the doors, beneath the stones, under the velvet, and inside the dust. And now, it's okay to let go, to drift, to sleep, to dream, not of duels or gold, but of porch lights, creaking floors, slow fires, and fading footprints. The West is quiet now, and so are you. Good night.